I'll go ahead and welcome us to the King Institute for Faith and Culture. Bristol took its toll on our schedule this morning because, as you know, the train stops for 20 minutes, and those who are visiting from out of town don't necessarily know how to get around it, so it took us a minute to navigate the way in. We are delighted today to have you here as we mark Black History Month with Dr. Bill Turner. Bill has been to the King Institute twice before, and we're delighted to have him back with us again today. He is going to be introduced by Tommy Bryant, a King graduate himself, but I want to give you a couple of announcements before I turn it over to Tommy. Immediately after today, we don't usually have time. For those of you who are visiting, we don't have time with class schedules to do question and answer at the end, but we do have a coffee reception, and I would welcome anybody who wants to come have a cup of coffee with us to the Tadlock House, which is out those doors, and you turn left and you walk till you see a nice-looking house, and that's where we're going to be. After that, at 11 a.m., we will be in the cafeteria at the Tipton room at the back of the cafeteria for lunch. And for those of you, any students, anybody who's visiting, we'd love to have you with us at lunch as well. And if you're a commuter student or if you're a visitor, we'd love to cover your lunch. So be sure you let me know. The upcoming programming for us is now going to take a short break. We don't come back until the end of February with the Becky Buller Band. That'll be on February 28th, so we have a little bit of a hiatus. We're delighted that you're with us this morning. Please do stick around afterwards if you can, and I'm going to ask Tommy Bryant to come and introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everyone. As I've said before, whenever I get a chance to come here, I'm always very happy to do so. I'm happy to be here today for a couple of reasons. The first reason is to introduce our esteemed speaker, and I'll let you know the second reason shortly. But I'll address my second reason first. Sadly, in this country, we are sort of faced at a pivotal moment where right now someone is fighting to deny my rights, my voting rights. Someone right now at this moment wants to erase Black history from our K through 12 system. Someone right now thinks that we should get rid of certain books. And I think that's deeply troubling. Perhaps America should understand that when you have an issue, to bury it deep and allow it to fester and grow only makes it worse. I think much like alcoholics who stand up and say, my name is, and I am an alcoholic, in order to affect some sort of growth, you have to acknowledge something and then move forward. And I think this, our speaker today gives us an opportunity to do that. And secondly, I think each of us individually has an opportunity to grow as well from listening to Dr. Bill Turner. I remember well the first time I get to hear him speak at UVA Wise, and I know the impact that it had on me, and reading his book, the impact that it had on me. So I hope that everyone has an opportunity at some point today to talk with him. I hope that everybody takes the opportunity as well to read his book, Blacks in Appalachia. I'm honored today to introduce you to the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, in my view. He's been writing about the plight of persons of color across the country and persons of color in Appalachia specifically for all of his adult life. As I mentioned, I saw him perhaps 10 years ago at UVA Wise. I had the honor of introducing him on this campus a few years after that. Very recently, I saw him at ETSU, and he talked about his new book, The Harlan Renaissance. And so whatever message he has for us today, I'm hoping that there are eager ears that will listen and that will take something from it. So I hope he's ready. Isn't technology wonderful?
Entertain us,
I have a question. How many PhDs does it take to turn on a light bulb? More than there are on this stage, I would assume so. Here, do you have it?
Just hold on, we're going to be ready in just a second.
They brought this for you. This is
I got it? Okay. Ah, there it is. Thank you, sir.
And now, without further ado,
This
for
has a
your
clicker,
listening
right?
pleasure,
Oh, yeah. Okay, there we go.
Dr. Bill Turner.
Thank you. Let's see. This is a college, university, and I'm sure that most of the students are multilingual, right? So I would like to greet you if we were in Jerusalem and say shalom. And if we were in Johannesburg, I would say house seat. If we were in Côte d'Ivoire, in West Africa, I would speak in French and I would say bonjour. And if we were in Mexico City, I would say buenos dias. But if we were in my home territory, which is in Harlan County, Kentucky, about 95 miles as the crow flies from here, we would say, how y'all doing this morning? Thank you very much for coming. It's my pleasure to be here. Dr. Dodowich and I were saying earlier, this is my second or third visit to King University. And I see my old buddy Preston Mitchell over here. Preston, would you please stand up? I have to recognize this gentleman. This is my friend Preston Mitchell. Preston doesn't like for me to say he's Episcopalian. I like to call him a priest, but he says he's not a priest. But he's doing some wonderful work in the history of black people in Southwest Virginia, to include memorializing multiple numbers of lynchings that took place in Southwest Virginia. So thank you for coming, sir, and God bless you. Okay, the origins of the modern civil rights movement. Now, y'all know the modern civil rights movement. Oh, thank you, Dr. Dodd. Oh, I have your picture on here. Yeah. Martin, my friend, the professor of history and director of the King Institute for Faith and Culture, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, now I want to start in a way so that I had a book with me. Would you have me my book right there, please? This is this book I wrote. You can buy one if you like it, or if you'd like to. We'll talk about it later. Any group of people who were marginalized and otherwise limited by virtue of their social class, their gender, their race, their physical status, such as being handicapped, or anybody who was limited by virtue of their sexual orientation, or limited by certain citizenship stigmas. Anybody who prior to 1954, between 1954 and 1980, I'll say, anybody who was hitherto marginalized, but since then they have been lesser marginalized. They owe it to the modern black civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, you just named the movements. And they all came out of the civil rights movement of the 1950s. And had that not occurred, a lot of the rights that people nowadays, for example, women in college under Title IX, it never would have taken place. Blood, sweat, tears, death made it happen. And that's what this is about. So if you can see that good, that just says the years between when this movement took place, between 54 and 68, and that now we think that African Americans have the same legal rights that white Americans have, but before the Civil Rights Movement, segregation and discrimination were legal, and then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1954 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and so these interlocking situations between race and class and gender and homophobia, immigrants' rights, LGBTQ rights, all of these, they interlock, but the fact of the matter is a lot of that has gone backwards since I was a young man. In fact, the Voting Rights Act is once again up for grabs right now in Congress. So that's why I want to start off with a precautionary tale. I understand that many white Americans, and I don't use white as an adjective, it's kind of like a noun, but I understand that many white Americans are fragile when you begin to talk about race. Is that right? I understand they go, ooh. So I want to have a precaution, ma'am, okay? Here's a precaution. If you grew up in the mountains of the South, you always see on Route 58 and 23 a sign that says, watch for fallen rocks, right? That supposedly took place. The legend is that there was a Cherokee down near Bryson City, North Carolina, Preston. You've heard this story, right? And he supposedly was out one day hunting for deer, and he apparently got a hold of some rabbit tobacco or something, and it disoriented him. You've heard this story? You're going to love this story. And it disoriented him, and he got lost. Falling rocks got lost. And so to this very day, driving anywhere in the mountains of the South, next to all cuts of vines, you'll see a sign that says, watch for falling rocks. They're still looking for it. Okay, I'm going to say some things probably in the course of my discussion that might hit some of y'all like rocks on your head, psychologically, emotionally, and all that kind of stuff. So this is my precautionary term. When the rocks start falling, I've warned you. Okay, here we go. First rock. It ain't easy being Black History Month. That's the first thing I need to say. In fact, I live in Houston, Texas. A few years ago, my wife and I decided we better go where our grandkids are, because we grew up around our grandparents. And we were living in a lovely 1845 cabin on the campus of Beecher College in Kentucky, where I'd worked for many years. And so we moved to Houston. And I tell people all the time, I can talk in months other than February. Okay? I've been away from home now since February the 1st, and I'll get back home on February 15th. And then, that sounds like a Sunday, I think. And the next, on the 17th, I'm going to go to Washington to the Appalachian Regional Commission and give a presentation. And then I'll go to Wheeling, West Virginia, and to Morgantown, and to Huntington, and to Ashland, Kentucky, and to Ironton, Ohio, and I'll get back home on February 28th, and my year will be over. Although I always tell people, Black History Month, I think, is for white people. There I go with another adjective, watch for fallen rocks. Because as an African American, I celebrate Black History Month every day. I do not wait until the coldest month of the year, the shortest month of the year, to do this. So it ain't easy being green, said Kermit the Frog. Now, here's another falling rock. One of the things that makes being a Black History Month, particularly in terms of my background in anthropology and history, is that we're in the middle of a cultural war in America. So the minute you start talking about Black History Month, except for souls like you who volunteer yourselves to come out and listen to this, there's some things going on now that started with something called the 1619 Project a few years ago in the New York Times, where people began to center on a legal case of when you started the foundational issue that everybody Black in America in 1619 was 3/5 of an American, that's where it all started. It was a taxation issue for slave owners. You can have 3/5 more votes because the more slaves you have, George Washington had 410, right? And we all know some of the nefarious things of Thomas Jefferson. But either way, they were slave owners. And how could they write those magic words of freedom and justice and equality, and we hold these truths to be self-evident that everybody is created equal, and at the same time, they held people in slavery? First big lie in America. If y'all think the big lie started a few months ago, you should go back 400 years. Basic concepts have to do with white privilege, systemic inequality, and inherent bias. Get those straight, you got the bottom of it. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, has called for a ban on the teaching of critical race theory. Get a hold of today's Bristol Herald-Courier, and there's an article about where Donald Trump essentially calls the prosecutors who are looking at his case, he calls them racist Black women, Donald Trump. The prosecutors in New York, the Southern District of New York, is a Black woman. Have you seen what they've said about the Black women who might become the Supreme Court nominee? When Reagan appointed a woman, nobody said a word. Trump appointed a woman, nobody said a word. Biden appoints a Black woman, and they all get hyperplectic. Is that a word? Apoplectic. Hyper-apoplectic. Yeah, that's the word. So where I live in Texas, for example, the governor himself has signed legislation that says you cannot teach this in the state of Texas. My daughter has a doctorate degree from Temple, and she teaches African American history, and she went to Spelman. She has a wonderful education, but she can't teach what she teaches in Texas. Can you imagine that? Virginia also, that man right there, I wish he were here. Is Matt Hahn in here today by any chance? Oh, nobody. Y'all know Matt Hahn? Virginia, somewhere in this neighborhood, Sullivan County, Tennessee, is it? Yeah. A white teacher taught his students about white privilege, and they fired him. Reminds me of an apology, Preston, from a Lutheran minister, I think he was, as to what we ought to be thinking when we look at things happening around the country, like so many dominoes falling. And that priest wrote, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak up because I was not a socialist, right? They came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because I was, y'all heard it. They came for the trade unionists, but I did not speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was nobody to speak up. So I'll just leave that with you. In fact, in Tennessee, in Athens, McMinn County, just last week, there was a case where this survivor's tale about the Holocaust in Poland, the district stood up and said, you can't teach that, right? You can't teach that. I can remember the time they said you couldn't teach To Kill a Mockingbird. Remember that? Black History 2022, they're whitewashing it. In fact, that wonderful graphic there shows a person literally whitewashing history. You're a historian. They're about to wipe out the face of the most militant black man in modern America, civil rights movement ever knew. His name was El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz Malcolm X. And I worked for Alex Haley for 10 or 12 years, so I got to see some of these people personally, got to know them, shook their hands. Martin Luther King, they'll probably leave him on there. Yeah, they'll probably, you know, I call it the Disneyfication of Martin Luther King. They turned him into a Disney character. They roll him out every January the 15th like a groundhog on February 4th, or the February 1st, when they go and get Poxatonksy Fred or whatever his name is. And he comes out and says, it's going to be 6 more weeks of winter. Same way with Dr. King. Every January 15th, they bring him out and say, look, kids, this is nice man here. And they don't teach these children, for example, that Martin Luther King was somewhat of a revolutionary Christian who believed that you should not commit war, acts of war. Nonviolence applies everywhere. I will not say my country right or wrong. If my country is wrong, I'm going to speak up. Martin Luther King died about a year after he gave a speech at the Riverside Church in New York City where he questioned the Vietnam War. Before you knew it, he was gone. Martin Luther King. Sojourner Truth, yeah, they just about got rid of her too. So this is what I'm talking about. As Dr. King said, I might not get there with you, but we as a people, he doesn't say we as a black people, or we as a white people, or we as a brown people. He says we as a people, I guess he meant Americans, we will get to the mountaintop. So the modern civil rights movement, as some of you all know, and I see some of you, I'm 76 years old, so I assume some of you are at least 66, 56, right? Anybody here 56? Oh, good. So you know, if you're 56 or above, you came along at the time of the modern civil rights movement, and it turned Southern society upside down. It changed the way we did business, and what I'm going to try to do is say, boy, if you only realize how much of that turned the world upside down took place within an hour of where we are right now. Most people associate the civil rights movement with Geesby in Alabama, and with Montgomery, and with Atlanta, and with Bull Connor, and all of those places. Actually, we want to talk a little about, what about how much of that took place right here in the dear old Appalachian Central region? So that just gives you a quick look at these labels of different parts of the United States. We got Yankees and Cajuns and West Coast people and Northerners and Southerners and red states and blue states and urban people and hicks and hillbillies, and Appalachia is part of all of that. We're somewhere near that star at the Tennessee-Virginia border, as you know, in Appalachia, which is the white part of that graphic, 14 states, 422 counties, roughly 26 million people live in that space, and about 3.5 million of them are African Americans. If you count Appalachia, the biggest city in Appalachia is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The next biggest is in the south, and it's Birmingham, Alabama. I like to think of West Virginia, what you call southern West Virginia, southeast Kentucky, where I grew up in eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, over around where my great-grandmother was born in Pennington Gap in 1862, and my grandmama was born in Virginia City in Wise County 120 years ago, and my father was born in Coburn, Virginia. That's what I call Appalachia. But, you know, there are people who call certain parts of Mississippi Appalachia, because in that sense, our favorite artist, Elvis Presley, is an Appalachian, because he was born in Tupelo. I don't think you can tell many of the people in Tupelo that they're Appalachians, but that's just another problem. King said that we're all in an inescapable network of mutuality. We all wear a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects you affects me. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Martin Luther King was much too, shall we say, romantic for a modern era. Because he just said, look at that little speck we all ought to occupy. Why can't we all just get along? Nobody knows why. If you want to read a good book called The United States of Appalachia, get that one by Jeff Biggers. There's one you've read recently, right, called Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. Gives you this beautiful, comforting picture of Appalachian people. Ha, ha, ha. He says it's a culture in crisis. The white working class is in crisis. The group has declined slowly and it's disintegrated over the past 40 years. And Hillbilly Elegy tells a story of what social, regional, and class decline feels like when you were born with it hung around your neck. I like to shorten the thesis of that book. If you've read Hillbilly Elegy, that's great. I think if you haven't, you should read it. And here's all it really says in its gist is, quote, white people should not live like this in America. It's okay for people of color, but man, white people shouldn't live like this. And he was explaining it in the context of this cultural war I start off with that says, your black neighbors want to take what you have. You remember up in Charlottesville a few years ago, they're taking our place. It's the replacement theory. It plays into the hands of people who are very anxious about their futures. And they think that immigrants and African Americans are zero-sum game. If they gain something, we lose something. So we better stop their gains. Politically, let's do everything possible, whether it's illegal, to stop them from getting any power. If you think it's anything different than that, you let me know. You remember I said falling rock zone. We got people in these mountains. If you go over here to Morristown, Tennessee, you have a lot of Appalachians over there. They're basically Mexicans, right? You been to Morristown lately? When I used to come to, is that the Holston River in Morristown, or is that the Clinch River? It's one or the other. I used to come there with my father. We'd go fishing every spring around Morristown and Rogersville. And we knew some people there that my father got to know. And now it's a situation where you've seen a total demographic shift where the number of Mexicans who live in Morristown, who work in a chicken factory, basically, they outnumber the black people in that county. And so that has happened just in the last 25 years. Hazard, Kentucky, the same way. The biggest restaurant in Hazard, Kentucky is called Arze Azur Grande. That means Big Blue. Now, if you're from Kentucky, Big Blue is a ring something about bouncing a ball or something. I'm not sure what it's all about. Carter G. Woodson, the father of black history, was a West Virginian. And he said, when you don't have a record of what your forebears have accomplished, you'll lose your inspiration. And so I think one of the things that should inspire young people in the Appalachian region, when you look at the alma mater of this college, I just read it going down the steps to the men's room. There's some neat words on there about Appalachia. You'll get inspired when you see what I'm trying to say about this region. There it is once again. I won't go through this too much, but the bigger cities are Pittsburgh, Birmingham, Winston-Salem, Huntington and Charleston, Greenville, Spartanburg, Knoxville, Chattanooga, Kingsport, Bristol, Johnson City. You can name them, these cities in the mountains. As y'all know, Tennessee is often split up like that. It used to be 3 states of Tennessee. You remember Tennessee was, what was it? Middle Tennessee, East Tennessee, and West Tennessee. They changed that. So what we're going to do here is follow a few of these footprints. The lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives more sublime, for in departing they've left behind them footprints in the sands of time. And so there's some footprints in the civil rights movement that took place around here. Early on, historians, anthropologists, they said the number of Negroes in the Appalachian region is such a small proportion of the total population that the consequences of their presence are not of any significance. They essentially said, it ain't enough of them to worry about them. And what did that lead to? It said, except for a few places in Appalachia where mining is big, and in a few cities, there are so few Negroes, we don't pay them any attention. And then one of the Negroes who came along and changed that was a man from this town, and his name was Charles Spurgeon Johnson. Charles S. Johnson. I was in a beautiful hotel over here. What's the name of the Bristol Hotel? In that plaza right there. Somebody looked at me out there last night trying to take a picture of the Charles S. Johnson sign. And I'm sure he said, hey, fool, why don't you wait till in the morning, man? But it was just, I taught at Fisk University when I was a young man. And my office was in Park Johnson Hall, named for Robert Park at the University of Chicago, and who was Charles Johnson's teacher. So it was like being at the Taj Mahal to me. The first black people in Appalachia in the 1500s did not live in the control of planters or railroad builders or mine operators. They lived with the Cherokees in Bryson City and in Cherokee in North Carolina. In fact, at the Trail of Tears in 1848, 600 black people marched all the way to Oklahoma because the Cherokees owned slaves. Very few people realize that, but that's the case. I was just in Cullery, North Carolina a couple months ago. Same kind of thing you can read. There's a good book called Appalachia in the Making, Slavery in Appalachia. You know, a lot of people say, well, we really didn't have slavery in Appalachia. Yes, we did. Yes, we did. You had slavery in New York City. So don't be making out like, well, we had a good form of slavery. There ain't no such thing as that. Here we go. I used to live near this place called Middlesboro, Kentucky. Some of y'all know what that is. That's roughly 130 miles from here. And part of the Underground Railroad, getting to the modern civil rights movement, took place at Cudjoe's Cave on top of the mountain in Middlesboro in the Cumberland Gap National Park. That lady right there, whose name is Harriet Tubman, when we talk about the Underground Railroad, when we talk about the movement of people in the 1860s trying to get across the Ohio River out of Tennessee, she was the equivalent to Snapchat and Facebook and Instagram, because she was the emancipator and the liberator, and she knew the North Star, Harriet Tubman. Here's a close look. 75 miles from here, you can go to a place called Morristown, Tennessee, and there was a Presbyterian minister by the name of John Rankin. And when he left here and went up to Ripley, Ohio in 1822, 50 years before the Civil War, 50 years, he became the most active conductor on the Underground Railroad. This man named John Rankin. A native of Dandridge, a Presbyterian minister. Elihu Embry, 1782, 1820. We're looking at people, 1820 now, 30 years, 40 years before the Civil War. He was in Jonesboro, the oldest town in Tennessee, which is roughly 1 hour from here. I came through Jonesboro the other day. And right in the area where you can find the International Storytelling Center is where he had set up shop in the 1820s, the first newspaper in the United States that was devoted exclusively to abolition. And then that led to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was influenced by him. And as you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became like the anthem about the Civil War. William Lloyd Garrison was best known as an abolitionist, and they influenced that man right there, whose name was Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass founded the North Star newspaper in Rochester, New York. That's a pretty good way from here, but that's the way the chain ran. If you want to study about someone who was really the precursor to Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X and Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, was a man named Martin Delaney, an Appalachian up in Charleston, West Virginia, who lived between 1812 and 1885, and he was kind of like the grandfather of these so-called militant blacks in the civil rights movement. Much like now we find the Ku Klux Klan, the Patriots, QAnon, the Confederates, neo-Nazis, racist skinheads, the Christian identity movement, white nationalists who focus on the alleged inferiority of non-white people. Well, on the other hand, black nationalism focused on we just don't want to, we want to be able to defend ourselves. 5 hours from Bristol area down near Chattanooga, going a little bit west of there, Pulaski, Tennessee, where the Klan was found. You have to mention that in terms of the civil rights movement. This fellow, once again, Marcus Delaney, I commend you to study his life. He met with President Lincoln, and he was one of the people who, in meeting with President Lincoln, said, "Why don't you do this, Mr. Lincoln? Help us to get back to Africa, and we'll just all go away." As you know, Abraham Lincoln voted for the movement of black people back to Africa so they would never have a race problem. He said, "Send them to Africa." And a whole bunch of them, through the American missionary movement, went to Liberia. And to this very day, African-American Liberians, that's a part of that. Everybody knows about this man right here as a Southerner up in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, John Brown, who had his own January 6th-like insurrection, right? And he and some free blacks raided the arsenal in Harper's Ferry, kind of starting the Civil War. That's why I have there, think January 6, 2020. It was the same kind of thing. One of the first incursions into a federal arsenal, what you might call patriotic free speech. My man, one of my uncles, my daddy's brother was named John Henry Turner. Wonder why they named him John Henry Turner. Because my grandfather worked on the railroad in Virginia, in Southwest Virginia, and named our Uncle John after this man right here, that legendary steel driving man who died with his hammer in his hand because African Americans built the railroads of the South, literally. Two other people who are highlighted in the civil rights movement, going back to Booker T. Washington, who was, I don't care what anybody says about Barack Obama, Booker T. Washington was the most powerful African American who ever lived in America. Bar none. Bar Muhammad Ali. Bar Beyonce. Anybody you can think of would never had the popularity and the power of Booker T. Washington. Carter G. Woodson, of course, was another one. Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose inspiration. That's what I constantly try to tell my students. There's your homeboy, Charles S. Johnson, who lived till 1956. He was born here in Bristol. His father founded the Lee Street Baptist Church that I happened to get lost next to coming here this morning. Was that Mary Street I was on? Yeah. He was a sociologist, and he edited Opportunity magazine for the Urban League. And this man from Bristol, Tennessee, was the first black president of Fisk University in Nashville. And you might say that more needs to be taught about him in this part of the country. This was a very, very powerful man, was Charles S. Johnson. Some more Southern stuff about the Civil Rights Movement came out of Scottsboro, Alabama. Anybody remember the case in 1939, wasn't it? Of the Scottsboro boys. 9 young African-American men, not a one over 20, who were accused of the proverbial rape of a white woman, and they put them all in prison. They later were exonerated. In fact, that was such a horrible case that I know of at least 20 African-American men in my own hometown in the coal mines of East Kentucky. They fled to Kentucky out of northern Alabama in the 1930s, 1940s to get away from, they were just picking up. I mean, if you think this all started with George Floyd, you don't understand the systematic nature of incarceration in this country. Because going back to after the Civil War, the coal mining industry in Alabama was at a loss to find workers. So what did they do? They entered a relationship with the state of Alabama and said, may we have every person in your jails, and we'll give you $5 a day for them. It was called convict labor. And guess who the jails were filled with right after the Civil War for vagrancy and large African-American men? I have interviewed men who spent 8 years working in a coal mine in Jasper, Alabama, And the state of Alabama got money from United States Steel, who owned the town where I grew up in, Lynch, Kentucky. The president of the United States Steel was named Thomas Lynch. And then they owned Gary, Indiana. The attorney for U.S. Steel was named Mr. Gary. They owned Gary, West Virginia, and they owned Birmingham, Alabama. So if you want to think about the company my father worked for 48 years for the most highly capitalized company in the United States, and that was United States Steel. They were the Amazon. Jeff Bezos had nothing on United States Steel. In fact, I got a wonderful interview yesterday. I guess it was wonderful. And I was invited to this elegant hotel called the Carnegie Hotel in, where was I? Kingsport? Johnson City. And when I looked up, I said, oh, Carnegie Hotel. Guess who owned United States Steel? Andrew Carnegie. And so when they asked me, tell us about U.S. Steel, I said, oh boy, you just threw old Brer Rabbit in the briar patch now. Because I couldn't wait to tell him how my father hated the Pittsburgh Steelers. He said they pay those boys more in a day to play football than they pay me in 2 years. They had died not liking the Pittsburgh Steelers. I said, Dad, they got a black coach. I don't give a hoot. They steal the steel. They stole us for hundreds of years. Boy, don't you tell me nothing about. Oh, he was very serious. Scottsboro is part of that. But if you want to really get to the center of what I'd like to finish up with, is all roads to the civil rights movement in the 1950s through the 1980s, all roads led to New Market, Tennessee. Everybody know what New Market, Tennessee is? Twix here in Knoxville, ain't it? New Market, Tennessee. There's a place there called the Highlander Center. The Highlander Center. It was ground zero for the strategizing for the civil rights movement. The Highlander Center. Started in Montego, Tennessee by a man named Miles Horton, who worked a Swedish model of education for adults. There's Miles, top right. There's Don West. There's James Dombrowski. All of this was going on at the Highlander Center in 1932. That lady at the top there, in 1955, when she was 42 years old, her name was Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks attended a strategy session at the Highlander Center, and a few weeks later, she didn't get up out of her seat in that bus. Oh, you all do remember the Montgomery bus boycott, right? So that Rosa Parks became a heroine to the civil rights movement, and everybody thought it was a spontaneous move of a tired woman who didn't want to give up her seat. Biggest lie I've been told. They rehearsed it because another woman in Eastern Carolina had refused her white colored seat on the bus 3 years before Rosa Parks. But they chose Rosa Parks because her husband was a lawyer. She was an elegant, light-skinned lady. I mean, all these factors bore into, they even had to stage civil rights struggles so that they would appeal to liberal whites. You just couldn't do it anyway. So they met at Highlander. There at the bottom picture is Martin Luther King, Pete Seeger. Y'all remember old Pete Seeger, don't you? Charles Hardin, Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy. They all met at Highlander around the time that Emmett Till was killed in 1955. I was 10 years old. I remember my granddaddy pulled me in and showed me a picture of Jet magazine. Y'all remember Jet magazine? And it had that bludgeon picture of Emmett Till where his mama said, open the casket up. I want the world to see what they did to my baby. And that boy was what, 13? Yeah, he whistled, they say, at a white lady. Martin Luther King was at Highland in 1957, and in 1956 they had gone to integrate a school in Clinton, Tennessee. And so we're saying all this was taking place within earshot of here. John Lewis was in and out of Highlander Center studying peace, nonviolence, practically every week when he was a student in Nashville. That's John at the arrow at the top. When he was just a young man, there's John after Selma. Another person, this lady right here, Septima Clark. Septima was a seamstress, but Septima was also a musician, and she recomposed a song that became the anthem of the civil rights movement called We Shall Overcome. I get so tired of singing that. When are we going to overcome? But she did come up with We Shall Overcome. It became the anthem of the civil, I can't even say the word, anthem of the civil rights movement. The man on the bottom right was one of those Malcolm X devotees I got to know very well for the last 40 years before he died. I knew Stokely Carmichael. He headed up a group that I was affiliated with called a SNCC in the 60s when I was in college. And one of the greatest honors of my life happened within a week of April 4th, 1968. I was 22 years old, and I was in the library, and a buddy of mine came running in and screamed as far as we hear to the back and said, "Bill, they done killed Dr. King, man." I said, "Oh my God, what are you talking about?" The next day, April the 6th or so, Muhammad Ali was scheduled to speak on a critical social issues at the University of Kentucky. I was a student in 1966 at UK in Lexington. I was the head of the Black Student Union. So the student government came to me and said, "Hey, you know, Ali can't come to speak. Will you speak for us?" I said, "Shoot, man, I got to practice up to go to King College one of these days." So I went in this place called Memorial Coliseum where Kentucky played basketball. And I went in there and there was 12,000 people. And I gave this speech called, "I Too Am Willing to Die." And my mother called me that night and said, "If you ain't careful, you're going to die down there, boy. You better shut your mouth." And shortly thereafter, a day or two later, I went down to Atlanta to Dr. King's funeral, and some of us in SNCC were selected to be behind the Caison, how you say that word? There was mule-pulled caisson, is that the way you say it? Well, you know, the wagon that pulled his, and I got to do what my granddaddy used to say. When we would ask our granddaddy, who had been a sharecropper, "How was your day, Pop?" He said, "Well, all I did today, son, was look up the south end of a northbound mule." At Dr. King's funeral, I got to look up the south end of a northbound mule with a shovel in my hand. And it meant so much to me as part of as a 20-year-old, 22, from Kentucky, never been anywhere. And there I was at Atlanta University with 1 million people. 1 million people were there that day. And one of the people I ran into was a priest. And this priest, Preston, he said, "Are you going to go to graduate school, Bill?" We were just sitting around eating a sandwich on the campus of Morehouse College, where my sons later went. That meant a lot to me, too. And I said, "Yeah, I'm going to go to school right over there at the Whitney M. Young School of Social Work," or something like that. He said, "Would you like to go to Notre Dame?" And I said, "They have a pretty good football team, don't they?" That's all I could think of. So I was able to get some help to go to Notre Dame just at the accident of being at Dr. King's funeral, because at that time, many of these schools were opening their doors to people like me. And so that I know that the sweetness of my tea comes from the blood of people who died, that I got to do some things that changed the life of my family and my children, my grandchildren. So some of you remember Clinton, Tennessee, just an hour north of Knoxville. They had a big thing there, Clinton, Tennessee. There are a couple of people, poet Nikki Giovanni, who meant a lot to the civil rights movement, grew up in Knoxville. The father of the blues is down in Alabama, not too far from here. I love that lady right there named Bessie Smith, the empress of the blues. She sang a lot out of the Chattanooga area. Nina Simone, I better go through that one real quick because she had a song called Mississippi. I won't say the rest of it. But if you just Google Nina Simone, Mississippi, the full title of the song will come up. Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee makes me lose my rest. But everybody knows about Mississippi. On the bottom left there, Henry Louis Gates Jr., a Harvard-based scholar, colored people, Southerner, Appalachian. Leon Sullivan, deceased. Roberta Flack from Black Mountain. Everybody remembers Birmingham, the largest city, the epicenter of the movement where those 4 little girls were blown away in 1963. And so here's what I've said. Appalachia has been at the very heart of the civil rights movement. 35 years ago, I think it was, I was able to help work on a book called Blacks in Appalachia. And just a month or two ago, I was able to see come into the world this book right here called The Harlan Renaissance. This is a book that I was able to publish back in October through the West Virginia University Press. Oh, what did I do? Oh, that's the end of it. Thank you very much. And I just want to leave this thought that as I started, Black history is American history. So don't wait until next February before you give some thought to some American history. Because America's at a critical turning point, I think, in its history, a much more critical point than when I was 22. And one reason for which I say that is I am having to repeat some of the same warnings about race to my 14-year-old grandson as my father and my grandfather said to me when I was 14. As the French say, la plus ça change, la plus ça même chose. The more it changes, the more it remains the same. And the only way we can change that is that those of us of goodwill get ourselves together and organize and strategize and be intentional about freedom and justice and equality. I thank you very much. Since we're in a Christian space, I want to recite one of my favorite verses in the Christian Bible. Preston, I think it's the book of Acts 27. And it said, God hath made of one blood all peoples of the earth. Thank y'all very much. Thank you.
I do want it noted that we match. We match.
Oh, yeah, here we go, bro.
It's completely unintentional. Yeah. I had my spies over there. We invite you again, if you want to join us to have some time with Dr. Turner, please come to the Tadlock House for coffee, or at 11 a.m., join us in the cafeteria at the Tipton Room. He'll again be speaking tonight at 7 p.m. at Central Presbyterian Church. Glad you're here with us this morning, and please thank with me yet again Dr. Bill Turner.